All right. So, our last lesson and the end of our American Revolution timeline, we have the Battle of Saratoga. This was a 3 week battle in which the British Army surrenders. Now, this illustration is not a correct illustration. This is actually an illustration from Battle of Yorktown, which we'll get to. But more or less, that's kind of a way how they surrendered. The white flag, and then after they waved the white flag, they also do when they surrender in person, they hand their swords or battalions, facing the other way to show like peaceful. They're not trying to attack. So the Battle of Saratoga was fought over 3 weeks, and the American troops captured the British weapons, and the British surrendered. And what was important about this win is that it kind of showed that the American army was not giving up. They were making a better gains in fighting off the British, and it was winning the favor of the France to join the American forces and bring aid. Then we get the winter in Valley Forge. And Valley Forge was a very harsh time for the American army. They were ill prepared for the winter, and they had very limited supplies and food, and have resorted to eating their horses when they could. Drawings and paintings usually show like wounded. They don't have enough clothes to keep them warm in the winter. Like it's snowing, it's freezing cold. Their feet were bandages and wrapped with clothes torn because they didn't have enough covering on their feet. But on the upside, that was just their winter. So it was a very harsh winter. Lost some soldiers. They lose their morale a little bit. But in the springtime, they get aid, and with that comes they get better training and support. French start bringing more assistance, and you start to get a more unified Continental Army. And George Washington is able to like recharge them one more time to keep going. So after Valley Forge, you get the new year of 1778, and that's in the spring of 1778 is where you get the help from France. So Benjamin Franklin, while all this is happening, Benjamin Franklin is in Europe trying to get help from other countries, from the Dutch, which the Dutch did also help from the Netherlands, but France was a much larger contributor in assistance. So we get military help, right? We get Comte Rochambeau and the Marquis de Lafayette, who was present and fighting, and he gets another higher rank in the French military. So we have a lot of those leaders who come and help us fight. And again, makes us a larger threat against England. All right, so then we get the Articles of Confederation. Now, this is a 2 year process. It was first drafted in 1779, but it wasn't ratified in 1777. It was drafted, but it wasn't ratified until 1779. Ratified meaning it was finally accepted by all of the 13 colonies. So all of the colonies had to accept this in order for it to be true and to happen. So that's why it's more of a 1779 thing. And what it does is it creates the United States of America, and it creates a friendly relationship of all 13 colonies, but friendly in the sense that there were still a lot of lacking powers that the bodies of government had. So, for example, Congress couldn't create taxes, they couldn't regulate trade. A lot of the money issues were still controlled individually by each state. So if you don't have the money, you don't have the power, right? So that's where the Articles of Confederation are always seen as weak, because whereas our Constitution has the three branches of government and there's checks and balances, why one is strong and the other one is strong also, and they keep the judicial, the executive, and the legislative in check. The Articles of Confederation didn't do that. So Congress didn't really have any powers, but except for to declare war and for them to agree on treaties. But it was a step in the direction of creating a unified United States. Then we get the South still is going, the South, British is still going, and they get a stronghold where their Patriots have a more stronghold in the North in areas. In the southern colonies were all controlled by the British, and the only defense from the Patriots were small little militia groups. You didn't have the large army groups that you had up north of the Continental Army or the American Army. So you had small little, like, they call them like guerrilla warfare, where it was kind of like hiding in the bushes, taking over little things here and there. Just because the British stronghold was larger in the south and they had huge ports, so it was a central place for the British Navy to set up and then move north as needed. And then we get to the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, our next event. And this is when General Lord Charles Cornwallis surrenders to George Washington and the French allies. A lot of events leading to this, and this is where you see the sword being handed over. First it was actually a soldier waving the flag with a little drummer boy coming to surrender. But we see that there was a blockade of the British by the French Navy blocking the British. They couldn't send supplies to New York. And then the army, the American and French army, took over all of the central areas that the British had around that New York area. Different places where they had different commanding groups take over until they had them all surrounded. And since Cornwallis couldn't get supplies, he was kind of surrounded. They were landlocked. They had no access to their navy, and they had to give up. And then we get to the Treaty of Paris. So it takes, obviously, for word to get around, and it actually took King George III. I know we're at the end of the paper, but do not worry, you can write it on the back. It takes King George III time to concede and actually give up and realize that he lost the colonies. Remember what we talked about King George? He really wanted to hold on to them, and they were his precious colonies. But he had to give up officially. And so the Treaty of Paris officially recognizes the United States of America as a country internationally. Whereas Articles of Confederation was more of like the beginnings of them being recognized as a united country. It sets the border to the Mississippi as far west, and then it asked Britain to remove all soldiers. Part of the conditions were that the loyalists who had fled to Britain, they wanted their land back, and that debts were still paid to British collectors. I think they said it was about like £5 million at the time. So Americans still had to pay debts. They had to give the land back to the loyalists, but Britain would remove all control and remove all soldiers. And that, my friends, is how we become the United States of America. And from this, we get our country, and then we move towards the Constitution, and the Constitution that frames our country. And that is just a whole bag of worms that you'll get in 8th grade when you learn about this again. And it's going to be new, but you could try to remember that you learned it in 5th grade first. All right, my friends, cheers.